Hello and welcome to Mulch, with me, your host Rebecca Anning-Brown. This is a weekly podcast for flower farmers who want to build a confident flower farming practice that reflects the lifestyle that you want now and in the future. Each week I'll share conversation and tips to nurture and grow you and your flower farm. I'll open conversations that flower farmers find difficult to talk about, provide approaches that will help you to make decisions, chuckle at the idiosyncrasies of our work, and always be real and honest about my own work as a flower farmer. My goal is to help you to grow a curious, confident and grounded flower farming practice that flourishes as a business that you love and are proud to shout about. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you like what you hear, please do leave a review and share the podcast with your flower farming friends. It really does help to grow a confident and successful flower farming community. Good morning and welcome back to Mulch. It is growing week 8. I'm just checking on the calendar beside me. It's growing week 8. It is grey, but not wet here in Leeds, West Yorkshire. I know that some of you have flooding because of all the rain from last week and the water table is so high. I hope you're okay. I'm thinking of you, and I know flower farmers around the country are just thinking of everybody, really. I wonder what it's like outside of the UK. Do you have crazy heat already in the States? I wonder if it's super dry for those of you listening in Australia. What's it like? What challenges do you have with your weather? Because evidently here in the UK over winter, we are getting lots of flooding and wind. And we had snow here last week as well, which actually offered me a hint of grace. It gave me a chance to get some meetings in that I hadn't been able to do before and to see some friends. And I also spent a little bit of time with a flower farmer friend, which was wonderful. It was a chance to talk about flowers and foliage and PPX and cuttings with somebody who doesn't glaze over when I talk for more than 3 seconds. My poor family, my poor friends. Anyway, I wonder if this sounds familiar to you in your world. So today's episode is inspired by the pallet load of manure that arrived on our driveway last week. I do feel very sorry for delivery men who come to our house because often we're not in and they just wonder if they've come to the right place because we're a standard domestic house on a standard domestic residential street. An HQ, other than the buckets and plants in front of our front doorstep, just looks like a normal house, which it is. So I guess for any of you joining today for Mulch for the first time, my name's Rebecca. I'm a flower farmer in Leeds, West Yorkshire. We are an urban flower farm, so our headquarters, our home is in central Headingley, near the cricket ground, in a really heavily populated area with students and families and older people as well. We have pubs and clubs at the end of our road, as well as churches and local shops. I mean, it's a really eclectic mix. And we farm up the road, and we're really lucky to have a farmer who allowed us to grow on his site. But it's so far from the ideal. It's so far from the ideal. And I think one of the things that makes it particularly challenging for us is that our flower farm doesn't run directly onto a road. So in season, that's absolutely fine. But out of season, so winter and early spring, the ground as you approach our field is soft and wet or icy, and we can't access it other than on foot. And our farmer is great. If he is around, he will carry stuff up in his tractor for us. But if he's not, then we transport things up to our field in a wheelbarrow or two. So I know that the question that often crops up first when I talk about land is, how did you find your space? How did you find your plot, your field, your acre, whatever it is that you're growing on? And there is a funny story behind us and how that happened. However, I'm not going to talk about that today because I think it's a peripheral subject. What I'm going to talk about is land in general, a bit about perfection, which is a theme that will reoccur in the podcast, and a bit about compromise, which is also a theme in the land of flower farming that we just have to get used to. And so compromise, problem solving, our approach is really, really flexible to allow for things that just are not and will never be perfect. So because of the nature of flower farming, if you're wanting to grow and you don't have land or know someone with land, there's this frustration that really builds because all you want to do is to get on and grow. And yet, to do that, you need space. And as many of you will have discovered, growing on allotments is perfect for really good practice. But if you intend to build a business, allotments often don't permit the sale of produce grown on site and or have really clear specifications on the ratios of food to flowers that can be grown, which means that they are less than ideal. It's a great place to start, but often it's just not enough. And quickly, if growing a business is what you really want to do, it becomes inadequate. Now, some of you might think that that's a bit of a goody two-shoes approach, but that's not my intention. As many of you will know, my background is in medicine, and that means that I am bound by the guidance of my regulator, both in my work life as a doctor and also in my private life as a citizen of the United Kingdom, which means that I have to stick within the rules. So I'm not being a goody two-shoes by pointing out what an allotment requires or what the guidance often is. I'm saying it because I physically am not permitted to break those rules, because to do so would potentially draw into question my license to practice. And whilst that may sound extreme, having worked for a regulator, I know that it's not. So that's the context in which I describe it, and that's the context in which we decided not to use an allotment for any of our growing, and to dig up our garden first whilst we were looking for additional space. So one of the things that I have observed amongst us flower farmers is that there's a delay when newer growers want to expand because we're looking for a site that is absolute perfection. And perfection probably does exist. However, my biggest word of caution to you, if you are in this position, is to consider how perfection was developed and whether it was there at the start. Well, why do I say this? I have in my mind the picture of a beautiful flower farm that I have visited. I'm not going to tell you where, and I'm not going to tell you whose. I'm going to explain and describe, however, their setup. It's a flower farm on leased land. It's leased land with a house on it, so they, as in the couple, live on the land and also work the land. They do have polytunnels and a big barn, growing beds, dedicated perennials area, dedicated windbreaks that sometimes does double up for cutting foliage too. The soil is gorgeous, and their environment is shaded and wet and sunny. There is something for absolutely every type of flower or foliage that you want to grow. And of course, they have access to water, and they still have space to expand if they choose to. They have electricity, there's space to be able to drive in because there's a house on site. I mean, it's just the absolute dream, my absolute dream. Okay, so let's look at the choices that these flower farmers have had to make to be in this position. The first is that they have made an active decision to lease a property and the land rather than to buy their own house, and rather than to buy their own house with land around it. So that means that if they had leased the land and it hadn't gone so well, they would still have to pay the rent and they would still have to look after and steward the land. And they couldn't just sell up and go. Whereas if you've got your own home and you're looking for land, that home is secure and it's a separate part of your work. And depending on how your lease or your rent is set up, your rental agreement is set up, then your freedom, if you decide that actually this isn't for you, is greater. And they have taken on the responsibility not just of growing on the land, but also stewarding it, which involves taking care of the boundaries, the hedges, the road access, the buildings, to make sure that if and when their lease comes to an end, it's in as good condition as it was on arrival. And they must do all of this within the guidance of the landowner, so they're not totally free to do whatever they want. They still need permissions from the estate owner to be able to expand, to grow, to put polytunnels on, to cut the hedges within the guidance of DEFRA. There are actually quite a few things that mean that they are required to follow rules rather than to just do what they want. And they do have a phenomenal shelter belt. It's beautiful, and they can and do cut from it. However, it wasn't present when they arrived, so they have had to invest in the trees and the maintenance and the care over time to build that shelter belt for their foliage and perennials that sit within it. And that takes time. And they've set up gorgeous composting bills, which are probably slightly weedy, but they have plenty of land and space to set up composting that means or allows for mulching of their beds without having to buy too much additional matter. I mean, I could go on. The space is beautiful and perfect, but I hope what you're starting to see is that the growing space wasn't a dream when they moved in. It certainly didn't happen overnight, because I happen to know that the previous use of that site was for food and for fruit harvesting, and the crops that were in there really are or were quite invasive, and it took a long time to dig some of those out because they had been there for so long. It is now my absolute dream, and I'm sure it's phenomenal to work as a piece of farmland. However, it's taken an awful lot of input to get it there. My second example is a couple who have bought a house with 3 acres, and they saved to look for this house and this piece of land. And it took 2 years, and that was 2 years of waiting to set up a flower farm that they were desperate to do. The site already had a polytunnel on it, which is fantastic, and the previous owners were market gardeners, which means that there were already beds set up. They have water, electricity, the soil is heavy clay, the tunnels flood to a good 5 centimetres predictably every winter. If there's heavy rainfall in spring, summer, they do the same. The mortgage means that investment in drainage is not within their gift at the moment because they've got bills to pay. And whilst they wait to do all of that work that you can just picture in your mind, they have needed to invest in sharp sand and green mace manure and sturdy shovels with the intention of improving the drainage and improving the soil so that they can get on and grow. And they've also dug channels for water so that it drains away from the tunnel into ditches. That is a lot of work. And you can see that whilst, again, on paper, they have what would be my dream, land at my back door, water, electricity, a tunnel, beds that I haven't had to make myself. They also have a really challenging growing environment with water and flooding and beds that are made but haven't necessarily been maintained to the standards that they would want, so they will take time to mature into gorgeous, lovely, workable soil with lots and lots of addition of soil improvers over time. It will, in another 3 to 5 years, be the perfect growing site, but there's a lot of work for this couple to do on the way. So what's my point? My point is that both sites for me appear pretty amazing, but neither are actually perfect, and both have their challenges. Both require investment and time, and both required the flower farmers, the couples, to assess the risks and to work out what they were willing to take on and which improvements they were able to do before they accepted the sites that they work and grow on. Both allow the flower farmers to grow flowers, but both have required the scale at which they grow to expand steadily and slowly because of the need for things to be dug out or drainage to be put in or beds to be improved to make them workable. These are all compromises. The commonality is that their intention is to get on and grow, but they have compromised, accepted and assessed risks, and over time they have or they will create perfection in the spaces that they work in. So back to the palette of bagged manure on our drive. Antony and I farm on a site that has no direct access to the road. Large deliveries can get to the field, but only when the ground is firm. We got through about 80 tonnes of compost as we made new beds last year. That's a lot of compost, and it was delivered onto the field, but we had to wait until the ground was firm and our farmer was happy, which is the right thing to do both for us and also for our farmer. And so winter and spring are challenging times because they're often the times when we are making improvements, we're clearing and making new beds, we are mulching and feeding so that we're ready for a new season, so that our plants are well loved and looked after. And lots of the things that we get up to the field during this sort of period is by wheelbarrow and child labour. Now, forgive me for describing it in this way because I'm not asking for empathy or sympathy. These are sets of circumstances that we chose because our compromise is that our growing site is closer to home than we ever expected that we would get one. And also, it was an opportunity that we said yes to because there were limited offers. We're an urban flower farm with prime time land for building on all around us. It's really difficult to find somewhere to grow. So the offer of anywhere that was suitable, and we do have gorgeous soil, is something that we said yes to. Historically, so in the past, we have filled bags of compost with manure from various sites that we found with lovely manure. If you go to stables and liveries, if you find local farmers who have plenty of horses and plenty of muck, there's always free manure around somewhere to improve your soil. And our farmer too has been able to get us manure at varying points in time. So that's been absolutely phenomenal. However, the time it's taken to find those sources, to fill the bags, to drive them around, to cart them up to the field has been really draining on time. It's been really challenging on family time. And also, it's physically really demanding. And we've reached a point where we've decided that actually the cost of buying manure is much less than the value of our time and the physical drain that our previous approach has required. And so this year we have bought poo. We've bought manure, and we've bought bagged manure because I can't get a truckload of manure up to the field now, and I need it now to be mulching my beds now. Now, you could argue, why was I not more organised? Why did I not get that manure delivered over summer last year so it was there and ready? And that is absolutely a valid argument and discussion to be had. Ultimately, the question is about finance, the flow of finance, and priorities at the time. So we weren't able to do it then. We do have some money to be able to spend on mulch now, and so that is what we've done in this particular time. We are building compost, and we started composting properly last year once we cleared an appropriate space. But until we have sufficient compost to be able to mulch all of our beds, we would still need additional sources over the course of the year. In honesty, my point is that it's a compromise. Having bags of manure in front of my front door is not glamorous, nor is my lifestyle. Wheeling barrows of bagged manure up to the field is a compromise, but it is much preferable to be able to pick the bags from my front door, put them in the car and drive them straight there than it is to be driving around Yorkshire looking for bags of manure that we can fill. And so those are amongst the many compromises that we make to be able to get on and grow. For me, a large part of our work as flower farmers is about problem solving, whether that's about wind, water, soil, the plants that we grow, how we support them, how we reach our customers. There are so many elements of problem solving that we do, and land is no different. So I'm not saying don't look for perfection. What I'm saying is when you're offered imperfect site after imperfect site, question what you would need to make it more perfect and more workable. Question whether the problems are resolvable, and ask yourself whether there are any alternatives that will require no or less work before you turn them down. Consider whether you're able to start on part of the site rather than wanting to use it all in one go, because if part of the site is good to go, good to turn into beds, that's enough to get started whilst you work on the rest. And above all, really think carefully about the level of investment personally and financially that you're willing to put into a site to be able to achieve a growing site that you're happy and pleased with. As ever, I hope that today's episode of Mulch has been helpful. It's quite a serious episode for me, but I think it's a really important thing to talk about because land isn't freely available to all of us, and so it's important to acknowledge that and consider how we approach that. What will we do? What are we willing to do? How are we going to approach accessing land to be able to grow flowers and foliage for an industry that really does want what we do? Ultimately, our most important thing is growing quality stems rather than growing quality stems in perfect environments. And so as long as your love for your work supports you to problem solve, all of those difficulties melt away when you produce those buckets and buckets of gorgeousness. Don't forget, my friends, that Flower Farmer Bingo is available to download in the notes. It is helping some of you to chug through your jobs for the month, and I'm really grateful for your feedback and to hear how much it's helping and to hear how much you're enjoying it. And there have been some very quiet bingos and one full house in the background. I wish I had prizes to hand out. Sadly, I don't. If you are struggling with problem solving and need a bit of a hand, do get in touch. I offer one-to-one mentoring sessions, and I'd be delighted to work with you. I'll be back next week for another episode of Mulch. It's half term. I'm not sure how frazzled I will or won't be by then, but I'm looking forward to speaking to you again then. In the meantime, have a fabulous week. Rebecca. Thank you for listening to Mulch. I hope that you found it useful. To find the show notes, head back to our website where you'll find links to all the things that I've been talking about in today's episode. If you're on Instagram, you can find us at Silver Grey Foliage. I would appreciate it so much if you were able to share this episode in your Instagram stories. And if you are able to leave a review, it really will help more people to get on and grow. I'll be back with you next Monday to talk about more flower farming in practice. Rebecca.